Hey friends, it's Michael Parker back with another UAP/UFO type video. It's been a while, and today my guest is Martin Keller. He is the author of the Space Pen Club's Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, UFO Disclosure, Consciousness, and Other Mind Zoomers. That's a heck of a title there, Martin.
I'm long-winded, Michael.
Well, so am I. So we're in good company. Today I looked down. I didn't even realize it, but of course, our good friend and billionaire overlord, Mr. Bezos, blasted into space this morning. I didn't realize until today that this was the 52nd anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing.
Oh, wow. Well, billionaires have to do something with their money, and this is what, two of the three biggies going off in the wild blue yonder.
Yep. And I also didn't know because I watched Branson last week. And in full disclosure, my wife and I both work for Virgin. I think I mentioned that to you in an email. But in the early 90s, I was one of the first American employees for their retail. And so I've always had kind of a romantic feeling about Virgin and Branson and everything. And I met my wife through there. So anyway, so I watched that the other day. I did not watch Bezos this morning. I mean, it was before I got up, but I guess everything went fine. They took off from West Texas and landed 11, 12, 13 minutes later.
Yeah, pretty quick flight, kind of reminiscent of the old early Mercury program.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because like yourself, I'm a big space geek. And, I remember, I'm old enough. I remember the first moon landing 52 years ago today. I was a kid, but we were out on a farm and it was late at night and we all watched it. And tell me about the space program and your feelings about it. I know that you're an appreciator and a buff.
I was a total space geek. I wrote to NASA for whatever they would send me, and they sent me autographed pictures of the astronauts from the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program, and all the literature that accompanied that, talking about the different missions. And then to follow up, when John Glenn made his historic 3 passes around the Earth, I wrote to him too, and I got a signed letter back from his office and an autographed photograph. And I mean, I think that was the start of it all, and then the interest in UFOs followed quickly thereafter.
I've been obsessed on and off at times, and I've been reading about it since a kid. So now, all of a sudden, 2021, June, we get this report from the ODNI. And what were your thoughts on that? You had a really nice article in the Star Tribune about it, but for those of us who are not in your area, talk about what you thought about the report and why now.
Well, a couple of things. I wrote an op-ed piece in anticipation of this government report landing on June 25th, and I laid out a bunch of different scenarios for long-suffering people like you and I who had great expectations, as Charles Dickens once said.
Yep.
That this thing was actually going to be a real government disclosure from a sanctioned government office. And it landed pretty much like a dud. 7 pages. I think I downloaded it 4 times thinking there's got to be a glitch here in my computer because it's only 7 pages, 9 pages, but 2 of them are hardly worth reading.
That's right.
It was a real disappointment. It talked more about their process of collecting data. They said they didn't have enough data to really make some conclusive judgments on what these things are, which is just total BS. I mean,
agreed.
The military's been looking at this since the 40s, if not earlier, and the Air Force in particular, which is pretty much written off in the report as like, oh, well, they're just starting to collect data. That's total nonsense too. I mean, we had Project Sign, Project Grudge in the late 40s, Blue Book through the late 60s.
Yep.
There's lots of data. There's tons of data. As Hynek used to say, the guy who had a Blue Book for a time, who came into the UFO world as a diehard skeptic and a kind of button-down scientist, he eventually came around and said, yeah, there's a lot here. there's quote unquote an embarrassment of riches. You just have to, it's there. You just got to go find it.
Well, it's interesting.
And not trust the government to tell you what it is.
You're right.
They're not going to do it. There's too many vested interests there.
I tend to agree. And when you try to explain this to friends or family or people who've not followed this, all of this is new to them in many cases because they've been told time and time again by media and by experts that, there was nothing to it. This is all kind of nonsense. And so they don't know about the history of this. And what's funny about this report essentially is the same thing that was said in the Rand report, which you mentioned in your book. And it was kind of the same things that were said by Twining and the man later after him, whose name I forget, but I mean, almost verbatim in this classification of like others and various options. So there's nothing new under the sun, I guess, but I mean, we know that's nonsense. And like yourself, I was disappointed. I didn't want to be the buzzkill, but another show that I work on, I was talking to my boss about this, and I didn't want to be the guy who just said, "Oh yeah, been there, done that." But I mean, it was completely underwhelming.
Yeah, it was. Look, if the U.S. government were a publicly held corporation, and in some ways our democracy kind of is that, the leadership and the board running this would all be fired because either for not failing to know what they are or for refusing to reveal what they are for 70 plus years now. I mean, they'd all be out on their tails if this were a publicly held corporation.
Well, before we move on, let me ask you this question, because you bring this up in that op-ed, Daniel Sheehan, who I believe is now representing Lou Elizondo.
Right.
And you knew him through CSETI.
Yeah, I kind of recruited Sheehan at a UFO conference. I was shocked actually to see him there because I've been a huge Danny Sheehan fan for his public policy, public interest litigation that he's done in the past, on the Silkwood case, Watergate, name it, Wounded Knee, Iran-Contra. I mean, he was a star of that in my book. And here he is at a UFO conference. And we started talking. And the more he talked, the more he sounded like Dr. Steven Greer, who I ended up doing publicity for in the 90s with CSETI, Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And a good part of the Space Pen Club book is set during that period.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, CSETI was trying to put together Project Starlight, which was an initial public disclosure, citizens-driven disclosure program. And we got Sheehan involved, and he's been there these many decades, long after I moved on from the organization for various reasons. But Danny raised the question early on Grant Cameron's podcast out of Canada right before the report. Why is this happening now?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the big question. I don't think it's really been answered.
No.
Obviously there's been pressure on agencies since the New York Times stories of 2017, 2019, and 2020 and 2021, and then this media pile on that we've seen in the run up to the report. I think there's been a lot of pressure to do something, but prior to this, there's been really no government entity or agency that has agency to disclose this. But now we have it, and that's a very interesting development. I think at least for me, the only positive thing to come out of it is that now we do have a much wider awareness, especially with the messengers, with the media folks, because they've been longtime skeptics.
Mm-hmm.
In their defense, they haven't had access to any spokespeople in the government because most people don't know diddly about the subject. But I think the climate has changed, but there's a lot of pitfalls ahead unless this thing is done right.
It's interesting you say that. What do you mean by pitfalls? I don't doubt you, but I'm curious what you're thinking.
Well, I think we don't want to see this as a giveaway to the military industrial complex.
Agreed.
Create yet another ultra enemy and fund billions of taxpayer dollars into space-based weapon programs, which a lot of people say we already have anyway. I think that's a really tough balancing act. We need to stay away from that. We need to be proactive. There's no apparent hostility on the part of these objects or whoever operates them. And as you know, I spent quite a bit of time around Greer, whose whole thing is close encounters of the fifth kind, human initiated contact, totally citizen driven, planetary citizen driven initiative to reach out to whoever these pilots are in these crafts, or whether they're robotic AI, artificial intelligence units, to reach out to them and to establish coherent sound interactions, citizen diplomacy, if you will. And that resonated with my politics that I've had since I was a kid. It resonated with me at a moral level. And I think that's the way this has to go versus let's find a new enemy to fight in space.
I agree. And the cynical side of me, the first thing when I read the report, and I said to somebody offhandedly, it's like, what I take away from is we don't know anything, and we're going to need a lot more money to find out, which of course is disingenuous, but them wanting more money is genuine. And so that concerns me. Well, let's turn to Steven Greer, because yes, much of the book is about that. And I've got to be honest, I always kind of had mixed feelings about Steven Greer. And I remember getting turned on to him, I guess, in the 90s. I would hear him on Coast to Coast or something, and I was interested in what he had to say. And over time, I was kind of like, well, I don't know what to think of him. But when is the last time you spoke to Dr. Greer?
I want to address that in 1 second, but I wanted to go back to something you said about the need for more money to study these.
Yeah.
That's the main thing that jumped out at me in the report.
Yes.
In 9 pages, 2 times they asked for, we need more investment. We need more capital. Look at this. I said, dudes, look to the black budget. That's where everybody else has been getting their funding for this.
Martin, so we saw the same thing.
Yeah, totally. Anyway, Steve Greer, I haven't talked to Steve in probably 20 years.
Does he know about the book?
I just sent him the book a couple of weeks ago. I have no idea how he's going to react. I mean, he should like it. I mean, it's not a Valentine, but it's not a hatchet job either.
Well, to the audience, I've read 200 pages of a 360-page book, so I don't know the ending yet. But so far, what my takeaway was like, yes, the things that you say about Dr. Greer makes me like him better than I thought I was going to.
Well, he's a very polarizing figure,
certainly,
and he may be his own worst enemy. He's in a kerfuffle now with Sheehan. This gets really inside baseball. We don't have to go into it for.
Well, I'm curious, and I think some of the people that are watching this, some of them are going to be up to date on this. So, I mean, if you can go there, you're welcome to.
Well, briefly, Danny Sheehan came out about 10 days ago over the Cameron's podcast again, and kind of denounced Greer's new film called Cosmic Hoax, which at one level is a reasonable assumption that there's going to be a false flag event around a faked ET invasion.
Right.
He lays it out pretty clearly, but apparently, according to Sheehan, Greer has twisted the words of Mellon and Lou Elizondo and Dan's own words from previous interviews to fit Steve's agenda for this film. And I keep waiting for a counterpoint from Greer on this. You know, it's kind of like these old 50s, early 60s pop hits where you'd have a first record, then you'd have a response record.
Yeah.
Like a call and response thing going back in pop culture. Well, I'm kind of watching that here in
the rap wars.
Yeah. Kind of watching that here in the UFO world, or the UFO ghetto, as Greer called it. But yeah, he has lots of detractors, and I point that out in the prologue. I said, you know, here was a guy that I met somewhat synchronistically, and I lay that out pretty clearly in the Spaceman Club book. Here's a guy that I met who some people currently think, he's the worst con man in Western civilization, and other people think he walks on water. But the truth is always usually in the middle. So,
well, and I mean, all through your writing, I come away with this. I mean, I haven't listened to a lot of what Greer said in a while. And I'll be honest, I'm not as deeply into the UFO UAP thing as I once was. I've had various internet shows and stuff where I was way off into it. But you're an intelligent man and a reasonable man and a man of good humor and loves rock and roll and good music. So, I mean, the things that you say about this man and what he said to you that impressed you impressed me, because I tend to agree with this more peace, less aggressive attitudes approach. But on the other hand, when we talk about communicating or beckoning UAPs and UFOs, I mean, that's a hard thing to believe is possible. But I you know what, for the listeners, explain just shortly kind of how the CSETI things work when you guys were doing a working group out in the desert, you're beckoning to these craft or whatever they are.
Well, the CSETI contact protocols, the Close Encounter of the Fifth Kind protocols, are based mostly in consciousness. Mm-hmm. The fact that humans as sentient beings have consciousness, awareness, and these other ETs, as we suspect they are, also have that same, we share consciousness. Now, Greer gives a full day lecture usually before he takes groups out into the desert or mountainsides or wherever these groups are being established. There's a whole training like a crash course training program in remote viewing and the underlying principles of consciousness which unite all beings. And once people digest that, you head out into the evening. Back in the day, in the 90s, we were using three modalities. We're using light and audio beacons, these high-powered lights. I think now the CSETI groups are using lasers, and also audio tones allegedly captured from a down craft in Canada and the crop circle region in England. And then you use basic remote viewing techniques using a process he called coherent thought sequencing, where you send out mental imagery to whoever or whatever may be out there, either at a distance or nearby. And this is a process that Greer apparently was taught in a close encounter of the fourth kind that he had as a young man back in Asheville, North Carolina, hiking in the woods by himself. And he had missing time, the whole thing, but he had this information and he tested it over and over again, and it seemed to work. So eventually he formed this organization, brought these protocols forward. And I tell you, the times that I was involved in either working groups with Steve's inner core group or within my own Minneapolis group, we had some interesting results, and they're all laid out in the book. We don't get them every night, but I'm the kind of guy that loves being under the night sky and looking at the stars, watching for constellations, satellites, whatever's moving up there. I've had that since I was in grade school.
When I was reading the book and you guys were talking about doing that, I was like, wow, if we'd have had these, when you're writing the book, because now there's the apps, where you can look up, because at one point, because where I'm stopped in the book, you had just gotten hypnotized and you had been on a watch and you guys were looking at a particular light, and Greer proclaims to the group that it is this is a UFO. You and your buddy kind of snicker and laugh. But I was thinking, these days we have these apps, and I don't even remember the name of the one I have, but it literally, I can point my phone at the sky and it can tell me, okay, well, this is a planet, this is a star, this is a passing satellite or whatever. How helpful that would have been to you guys at that time to know, okay, well, at least we know what that is.
Yes and no. I kind of like the funky rudimentary approach that we took back in the day. That guy in the desert that I shared the laugh with was Dr. Richard Haynes who had worked at NASA Ames, and then later that night he hypnotized me to explore an incident that's talked about in the book in chapter 3. Well,
let's talk about that a little bit, because did you, at the end of the hypnotizing where I'm at in the book, it's still a bit obtuse. At this point in your life, do you think you know what these red spheres were?
I don't.
In retrospect,
and that's a troubling notion, and that's a thread that runs through the book. Like, that's kind of a quest to find out what was this phenomena in my bedroom. 5 little red orbs at 4:03 in the morning, one fall morning back in Minneapolis, after I'd gone to a International Association of New Science event in Colorado to interview people about Greer's initiative. Because initially I came into this whole program again after not really caring about UFOs for 20 plus years. I came at it as a journalist, and I wrote like a 25-page story on Greer that I couldn't sell anywhere. Today, I could have published it on the internet, any number of places for 25 cents. Back then, it was, this subject was just way out in the margins still, and now it's been more mainstreamed. But that's one of, I think, the shortcomings in the book for me personally, is I still haven't figured out what these were. Were these ETs? Was this some sort of spiritual attack, or was it a manufactured attack? Was it something that was out of the MK Ultra world, some kind of psyop operation? And I explore that pretty heavily in chapter 3. If anyone can get through chapter 3 in the Space Pen Club, it's smooth sailing from there on out, because it's a very challenging chapter. It's a very challenging subject. Was this the real thing, or was this something that was manufactured by good old humans on this earth?
Well, I'm certainly aware of MK Ultra. When I got to that point in the book, you bring up a man whose name escapes me at the moment. I had not heard of him. And
Martin Keller.
Yes. Okay. So I feel a bit unhip. I didn't know this person. And you're saying that after he writes this book or manuscript, he later
he disavowed it. He was attacked, and he said, I'm withholding my theory. I'm pulling my judgment on this. This thing has caused me nothing but trouble. And I think my point in the book was that, this guy protests too much. Originally, I read a 57-page monogram called The Controllers, which lays out the case for this being a manufactured event. Very highly researched, scientifically approached, and then he turned it into a 300-page book that is now out of print. But there's also some collaborating other evidence that is in the book that supports Cannon's position. And subsequently, there's been a book by Helmut Lamar, I think, and his wife on military abductions.
Yes.
Which I didn't read. I purposely didn't read it. I read enough about it to say, okay, we're back in Martin Cannon territory again. And, I've moved on from those experiences. But frankly, Michael, I'd like to know what those were. And here's a little spoiler. That wasn't the first time I saw little red orbs in front of me. My best friend Jim and I, when we were in high school, encountered a singular red orb in the park on the way to a student council meeting one cold ass night in western North Dakota. And this thing came down. we were walking through Rocky Butte Park to my high school on the other side of the park. And this thing came down off of the peak of the butte, and it kind of hung in front of us for 10 feet in front of us for about 3 or 4 minutes. Well, we just kind of stood there and puzzled over what the hell is this? And being good Catholic boys, I said, it's the devil, it's red. And,
yeah.
And then it either disappeared or just vanished. Neither one of us can remember how that episode ended, but we obviously went off to school because we were student council officers and we had to be at this meeting. So that's one of the frustrating points in the book. Was this a staged incident by some sort of operative team, or was this ETs, or was this completely something else?
In the late 90s, I was going to MUFON meetings quite a bit. And a woman came whose name I don't recall, but she was talking a lot about the whole MyLab thing and the military.
Yeah, that's the acronym I was looking for.
And I kind of had the same feeling you did. I'm like, well, if this is true, this is almost worse, because
it is worse, I think.
I agree. And on one hand, I was like, maybe that's a bridge too far for me to think that we would go to all this trouble. But on the other hand, if we are, then that's actually really a really bad thing. And so I put that aside as well. I didn't want to delve into it. Now, what you're describing with these red orbs, now, was this a daylight sighting? Because I remember the sighting you talk about during the basketball game. I don't remember this particular sighting that you're talking about. Was this in the morning? Are you on your way to school, or this is an after school meeting or something?
Well, there's 3 things here. The 5 little orbs is in the 90s.
Right.
That's 4:03 in the morning.
Yeah.
And then the singular orb was set in high school.
Right.
And it was an initial sighting, followed about a month or maybe 2 weeks later by a group sighting of me, Jim, and 2 other guys at our high school halftime during a varsity basketball game, when somebody came in and yelled, "Hey, there's a big UFO out west of town." And our high school at that point was on the edge of town. I grew up in a little town called Dickinson, North Dakota, about 9,000 people. So we ran out there without our coats, middle of winter, 20 below zero, and we saw it. It was a white light hovering about 30 feet above the ground. Everybody was talking about it, and one of my friends that witnessed it with us said, "Let's get in my car and go see it." And I think I was the dumb guy that said, "Nah, that's what everybody's been reporting all week on the news," because that week there were UFO sightings all over Western North Dakota.
When we talk about the orbs, because I have friends who've witnessed them over water, the orange orbs off the East Coast, the Carolinas, and I have one friend who's done research into the possibility that the orbs and some of the UFOs are like a bioluminescent organism of some sort. And I don't tend to think that's what's happening, but I could be wrong. And what you're describing to me in regards to like the military intervention or some type of psyop, I would hope that's not true. And for some reason, it doesn't totally resonate with me. I because you're a young man growing up, unless they're setting you up for a lifetime of faux contacts or something, I have to think that this is legit.
Well, Cannon makes that argument that the technology exists where this could be, you could be implanted with something from a young age and controlled using these psychotronic weapons that are now off the shelf after 50 or 60 years. And he gets pretty into depth with the people that came up with this technology. To Greer's credit, he wrote a really insightful, eloquently articulated essay about this 20 years ago, which he has since dragged out, since he feels like there's going to be this, what he calls cosmic hoax
Right.
with all this alleged government disclosure going on. Canna makes a pretty good case for it. Greer makes a pretty good case for the fact that we do have technologies that can fake ET, real ET activities, and let the buyer beware, as they say.
Well, yeah, I don't doubt that we have the technology, and I mean, in the early 2000s, and I think that Greer was responsible for that National Press Club meeting. I think in
Right.
early to mid 2000s, and they talk about Project Blue Beam and things like that, and those are insidious ideas, and I don't put it past various parties to do that. I mean, but at this point, I almost think you don't even have to go that far. I mean, if you put something out in the press these days, people believe it. They're, television told me such and such, or you just browbeat people over and over with an official story. Yeah, well, we believe it. And it's kind of a sad state of human psychology, but there is a portion of the population, especially I think older generations, they still believe what they hear on television or what they hear in the press, and they're maybe not as cynical as I've become or skeptical, but A, I believe we have the technology. B, I don't even know if you have to go that far.
Yeah. Well, someone who's worked both sides of the desk as both a journalist and now a publicist for 25 plus years. I know how media works or doesn't work. I trot out a lot of stuff that the media has written in the past in the book, explaining how totally offline they've been about it. There's never any, in my experience, there's never been really good reporting on it because nobody will take the time to read the books, look at the research. I've read a fair amount of UFO books in my time, especially in the run up to writing this book over a 10-year period. And, I was Greer's publicist for a long time, and I thought, and I got to be out of my mind. Nobody's going to buy what this guy's got to offer. And Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. Are you kidding me? What do you mean there's a mind component? But time and again, I've got this note, and this is one of the sort of epigrammic things that opens chapter 3, I think, or 4, where Colonel John Alexander, who wrote a book called UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities. Alexander writes, "We agree that at times hard physical craft exist, but there is much more to the phenomena. Unfortunately, the true boundaries are unknown. It seems certain that human consciousness is at least part of the formula." And I think that's a very revealing statement. Now, if you put Greer and Alexander in the same room, you're gonna have a cat fight. It's not gonna be pretty because they've sparred in public, in the press before. But I think this whole role of mind or consciousness is a key element in the discussion, and that's one of the things that attracted me to Greer as a journalist. I thought, well, this is a missing part in ufology. This could be very interesting, and guess what? 40 years later, it still is.
But that brings me to something else, which is in the book, you talk about the various classes of ufologists, and there's the hunters, there's the data people. And one of the things that I've seen, and you touch upon this in a different way, is that in this post-Nimitz tic-tac world, I've noticed that there is a group of kind of new ufology people, and they're a little bit snobby, to be totally honest, and they're very afraid of the woo. And I'm not pro woo, but listen, I also know enough to know that I don't know enough to completely discount anything.
Well, there's a good passage in the book about Dr. Richard Haynes, who hypnotized me out in that Arizona desert during a CSETI exercise. Haynes just comes right out, and this was, 30 years ago. He said, science isn't equipped to deal with this. I used to think it was, but it doesn't. It's finite. What we're dealing with here is post-scientific as far as our science will take us. It doesn't take us far enough. And that thread, I think, runs through the book. I don't know if, Michael, if you've read Dr. Colm Kelleher's book on Skinwalker Ranch.
I have not. I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it yet.
Well, I put off reading it until I finished the Space Pen Club book because I didn't want to be influenced by it.
Mm-hmm.
I knew enough about what they had done, Kelleher, under the umbrella of Robert Bigelow's NIDS organization, National Institute for Discovery Sciences. I made an overture to those guys after I left CSETI to become a publicist for them. And I flew out to Vegas and I met them, and Colm and I went to dinner and we talked about, talking UFO scuttlebutt and then personal stories. I shared the story of the orbs with him, and he was very interested in that. And when I was done, he said, "Yeah, we had that experience with red orbs at the ranch." I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah, they spooked the horses." Well, when you read the book, they did more than spook the horses. It's pretty disturbing. And I asked him over a nice plate of Mexican food. I said, "Well, what do you think they are?" He says, "We don't know, but we don't think they're benign."
Right.
And I went, "Oh, well, that's not the answer I wanted. My puzzle is still unresolved."
Well, that's another point that I wanted to address, because at one point early in the book, you talk about Stephen Hawking making a comment, and he makes this comment that he's concerned about are the extraterrestrials, if they exist, are they evil? Are they a danger? And you make a point that is, kind of concerning from one of the greater minds of the 20th and 21st century. But you know what? I mean, on the other hand, I also can't believe that they're totally peaceful or loving. I don't know enough to know. And then there's a guy like, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's just poo-pooing the whole thing. Like, this can't even possibly be real. I'm sure this is a computer glitch or something. These very intelligent men are exactly the kind of people that you would really want looking into these kind of things, if they only would, and if they would read the literature, as you mentioned about Hawking. Now, of course, Hawking's passed away, but these are the kind of guys that we would all hope would be on the case.
Well, it's also the kind of guys you want in those positions who will mouth the party line.
True.
Who probably have been screened during their job interview for these roles. Probably not Hawking, because you don't screen Stephen Hawking, but Neil deGrasse certainly. I mean, I'm sure that was explored in his job interview. Like which topics are we going to explore and which ones are out of bounds. The Hawking comment was disturbing because it played right to the fear base.
Yes.
I mean, I think for instance, if Greer or somebody, or even Stanton Friedman sat down with them, the late great Stanton Friedman, the pioneering lone researcher for years and years, sat down with him and shared the data that exists, we might have a whole different conversation here.
Agreed. I saw Stanton speak in the 90s or early 2000s at MUFON. I was always a fan. But you bring up another great point, which is this whole idea that if they're going to try to use this OD&I report, as Greer fears, as prelude to some form of false flag.
Yeah.
Well, my argument against that, and I'm in no way unique, is just that, listen, they've had millennia. If they wanted to take us out or take over, you surely would have done it when we were less able to defend ourselves.
Yeah.
And then the other point is, then if that's not the case, then they've already taken over, because so I don't know. If I've told people, it's like, if they try to trot that out, I'm calling bullshit. It's like, but I don't doubt that they probably will try to.
Well, it's interesting to note that the ETs or whoever they are, these objects really showed up en masse in the 40s when we started detonating atomic weapons.
Yep.
And not just Greer, but others have pretty much through consensus said that the nuclear threat is not just a threat to the people on the planet and the planet itself, it's probably a threat to the life forms in space, and that it probably somehow rents the time-space continuum or the fabric of space. You know, the ETs, I think, are concerned we can't have you guys on this hostile planet bringing this shit into outer space.
Yep.
It's not acceptable. And that's a good point that Danny Sheehan, again, to his credit, made recently in the run-up to this report. He says, you know, you look at, and Dan's pretty well read on topic. I mean, he's briefed Carter on this back in Jimmy Carter's presidency, wrote a paper for Carter on it. He knows the Vatican is sitting on a pile of information in a off-limits library that he's tried to get into several times. Sheehan made a very interesting, telling observation. He said, in all of the CE4 cases, you know, where you have interactions with humanoids or ETs of one stripe or another and humans, the messages are always the same. Number one, your planet is degrading environmentally. It's not acceptable. You got to clean this up. Number two, you got to get rid of nuclear weapons. Those are the messages always to when you have these CE4s. And I think that's a pretty consistent message that runs through my book. I take a hard look at the the Minot Air Force incursion, which a friend of mine, Tom Tallene, researched. It's a hell of a report. It's online. You can find it. Just look for Minot 67 research, Tom Tallene, and you'll be fascinated by what you find there. I quote a good part of that, but I mean, here's where you've got an object that comes into one of the premier Air Force bases on the perimeter of the country, and it not only wreaks havoc with the guys on the ground, but it moves the 20-ton concrete slab off the silo and scrambles the launch codes. I mean, come on.
You know, when I read that, because I'd kind of forgotten about that, and you mentioned Maelstrom as well, and I believe that was 75 and Minot was 68. But I put your book down and I go on YouTube and I start wanting to watch the videos. And then I remember the documentary that you mentioned, I think it was 2005 or something. And they do take some of your friend's work and they put in, but they leave out these brilliant parts that he included, like the fact that those giant doors were moved. One of the police, whatever they call the military police cars, the top of the car is scalded. Right. These guys are unconscious.
Yeah. A couple of guys freaked out too. Bob Dean, the late great Bob Dean, who appears in the book several times, played for us one time at a CSETI meeting the sounds from the base of guys shooting at the saucer overhead. And there's a lot of screaming and everything. I always pestered Bob to give me a copy of that audio tape, but he never did. But you know, that RAND report, which you mentioned earlier, came out in I think the early 90s. It was done. The research on it was done in the 60s.
Yeah. It
was never peer reviewed, which is a little suspect in my mind. But if you read it, it's very well researched. It's annotated like crazy. And it says right there in the report that a lot of these objects are seen around atomic nuclear facilities. And what's the guy, Michael, is it Hastings?
Yeah.
Getting his name wrong.
And Robert Hastings, Robert Hastings
has written a book about it. I mean, the stuff is out there. I think the thing that's missing from this ongoing government research, because apparently there's going to be another report in 90 days. Don't hold your breath, Michael.
I'm not.
I think the thing that's missing and that the government would be smart to do is enlist the support of some of these citizen UFO groups and research organizations like Dick Haynes, who's in the book, who hypnotized me in Arizona. Former NASA Ames guy, very sharp, very bright, well-read on topic. he established an organization, I think in 2000, called NARCAP, National Aviation Reporting Center on Anomalous Phenomena. And their big thing is safety around airports and air traffic, because there's numerous documented, you don't have to look far to find incursions into the airspace of, like, Chicago O'Hare is one. These things have happened in China and Russia and England. And it's, they're a threat to the aviation sector. And NARCAP tracks these, and they try to educate pilots and aerospace industry about them. But Dick and people that work in NARCAP, they're sitting on tons of data that would be relevant to this next report or any future reports down the road.
The O'Hare thing, that was 2006 or 2008, fascinating case. And then around 2008 as well, the Stephenville sighting, which, it got some play at the time, but to me is fascinating because that's kind of my neck of the woods. And they called out, I believe, 12 different jet fighters, and they had radar tracking of whatever that thing was traversing across Central Texas. And then this past summer, last year, we had about 3 different incidents over LAX of these flying humanoid, people were like, well, maybe it's a hoax. It's a drone shaped with a mannequin attached to it or something. But
it's Hollywood.
Yeah, it is Hollywood. And, some people say, oh, it's Elon Musk wanting to be Iron Man or whatever. But yeah, whatever it was, you could argue that, yeah, that was actually endangering civilian aircraft, and whoever was doing it was very irresponsible. But as far as I know, they've never figured out what that was.
That Stephenville case, I've always been suspicious of that. I always think when there's fighter jets trailing an object that closely, it's probably one of ours that's having trouble. It's probably one of our, ET technology powered vehicles that we haven't quite figured out how to fly safely or cogently. So, but it's all up for grabs. There's no textbook on it. Not yet, anyway.
Right. Well, let me ask you this: what lies ahead for you? Because I understand, you and Greer called this UFO ghetto. I totally relate to that. You talk about going to some of these UFO conventions, and they're all new agey, and there's the hawkers and the vendors. It was funny to me because I would go to those as well, and part of me really is engrossed in the subject. Part of me also appreciates the entertainment aspect of it, which turns some people off. But I guess what lies ahead for you now? Are you kind of like done with it, or?
Well, I say in the book a couple of times, this is my kiss off to ufology, and yet, here we are, middle of 2021, neck deep in all of the different silos that surround this discussion, and I'm not sure what's next. I'll obviously keep my eye on this. It's hard to just shut it down completely. I euphemistically refer to my experiences and who might be behind them as the boys upstairs.
Yes.
And I occasionally will say to my wife, hey, did you see this story about what the boys upstairs did in so-and-so? And if we have a high strangeness event, and we had one recently, I'm not going to go into it because there's not time, but I always say, well, the boys upstairs are active again. And that's kind of my catch-all for the weird stuff that happened in my house and some of the stuff that happened in the field with Greer. I don't know what's next. I think my next book is probably going to be about Bob Dylan, because I had quite a few close encounters with Bob in the 80s, and I got to go on the Never Ending Tour in 1990 for a week through a swing through the Midwest. And I have a lot of good Dylan stories I haven't told yet, and I have a lot of insights into what I think is Bob's MO, although nobody really knows Bob's MO. But I think that's my next book project. But I'm going to ride the Space Pen Club story for a while and see where it goes. I'm blogging about it at thespacepenclub.com.
Let me interrupt you for a second. Yeah, I didn't mean to not get into this. Explain it, because I felt a little unhip again. Explain to people what the Space Pen Club actually is, because I was not hip to it initially when I read about it in your book.
Well, it was it was kind of an insider thing in college. One of my college classmates, Dennis, came home from the college bookstore where he worked one day with the Fisher Space Pen, the first pen to write in space. And it writes underwater or writes across Greece. And it kind of became an in-joke among a few guys in the dorm. And then pretty soon they started to take it seriously, and they created this sort of ad hoc Space Pen Club. And we'd have spring and fall festivals called Space Pen Club, the Rites of Spring, or Peak with the Leaves. Now, this is back in the 70s. You can imagine what kind of mind zoomers were in play.
Yep.
To help you peak with the leaves.
Absolutely.
And but really, in writing the book, I interviewed Dennis's roommate, Handsome Harley Hughes, who said, the space pen means a lot of different things to different people. And to me personally, it represents cosmic consciousness, transcendence, cosmic communications. And back then, the occasional quest for girls, beer, and controlled substances.
Who could blame you for that?
But Dennis, Hughes said Dennis ultimately believed that the space pen represented possibilities. And I think that's what the UFO discussion presents. Endless possibilities. And the great endorsement I got from Danny Aykroyd, I got to throw this out there. Dan's he's a lifelong saucerologist like you and me. He knows these things are real, and he thinks their technology could solve a lot of the world's problems from energy.
As did Greer. That was part of Greer's.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what the Space Pen Club is and was. In fact, there's a core group of Space Pen Club members that still meet every Wednesday evening on Zoom, and they still get together in pre and post COVID periods to hang out and fish, golf, or whatever. But I heard from quite a few of them that I hadn't heard from when the book published. Keller, what the hell, man? You made us famous or infamous. I like to think of them as kind of a tie-dyed Dead Poets Society group, of which, anyone that's seeking higher consciousness or interaction with other beings, you're in the Space Club, baby.
Well,
come to the meeting.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Let me ask you, because I'm not in a huge hurry unless you are, but let me ask you about Aykroyd, because I'm glad you brought it up. And clearly this is a man who has had this lifelong interest as well. And I've heard him do interviews where the guys, I forget things. And I'll read stuff and I'm interested, and then I'll forget the dates. But like Aykroyd is just nailing it. He'll just go down this litany of things to tell the interviewer. And you would think that a man like Mr. Aykroyd with fame and money and celebrity, you would think somebody would invite him to a party and say, hey, so here's the deal. Does he have some insider knowledge that he can't pass on, do you think?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if he does. He's very determined in his statements he makes about it. There's no gray area for him.
Right.
I was delighted to get his endorsement for this book. It's pretty generous. It's a couple paragraphs long. Yes. And it was kind of a shot in the dark. I sent him the manuscript in November of last year. In early March, I got a note from his assistant. Danny is happy to write an endorsement for your book, and I'll send it to you in the next couple of days. And then I heavily revised chapters 9 and 10 and let him know so that he didn't miss these, because I think chapters 9 and 10, there's a lot of payoff for readers. Like, okay, we're going to make some conclusions about this, and we're going to ultimately leave the discussion open-ended. But, and then I sent him a book recently along with a space pen, an engraved space pen. There's lots of different space pen models and styles. This company's been around for since the late 40s,
I was on their website last night. After you turned me on to them through this book, I was looking at their pens, and looks like a lot of them go for around $35 or so.
They're wonderful pens. They're kind of an elite writing tool. The astronauts use them, obviously. And I think the interesting thing about the founder, the late Paul Fisher, the idea for the space pen came to him in his sleep, in consciousness. And this is a thread that runs through the book: consciousness, consciousness. That's why I put it in that very long title of mine, that subtitle. Before I even met Steve Greer, six months prior to that, there was some weird stuff happening in the house. And then I had this precognitive dream in Minneapolis in May. And then in July, I'm in Boston with my parents to go to Red Sox games at the Green Monster and at Fenway. And I'm walking over this footbridge and I go, oh, wait a minute. This is the exact same harbor landscape I saw in my dream 6 weeks ago, sleeping. Although the original dream had a flying bus in it, and I subsequently learned once I fell into the ghetto, as Greer calls it, although we're all in the ghetto, Michael. We're all in the UFO ghetto.
Yeah, I know we are.
He said and Steve Greer. In fact, I don't use the word ghetto in chapter 10. I call it the community.
That's a step up.
It's kind of a setup, It's like, the C said he is above all this, and no, it's part of it all. But anyway, I'm standing on this footbridge, and I found out subsequently that flying bus imagery is often masked UFO or flying saucer imagery.
You have another symbol in one of your stories where you're talking about you're following Greer, and a skeptic is with you whose name I forget. So you guys are going to go off into the woods because you're pretty sure you're going to find this. Yes, you think you're going to find a UFO, and then you find
Outside Magazine,
and you find an owl. Yeah. Well, you know what it made? Okay, this is how ghetto I am. The first thing I thought of, well, we all know that sometimes owls are UFO ET iconography. So that's how conspiratorial I am. So that's what I thought of when I read. Maybe it was a UFO disguised as an owl.
Yeah, you never know. But we took a real beating from Mr. Hurd in Outside Magazine, and then I think in chapter 6, where we go to Mexico with the CBS team from 48 Hours, and they make us look like idiots, even though they were witness to some of the stuff we saw at the top of Mount Popo, the big active volcano there, one of the second largest in North America. It's a really good read. If you read only one chapter in the book, read that chapter, because aside from the adventure of going down there and having these guys shadow us and then making us look bad on national television, I called all my friends and said, hey, you got to tune in. I'm going to be on 48 Hours. And nobody called me afterwards. Nobody emailed. I think they were all too embarrassed for me. And, but I forgot where I was going with this, but that's a really good read. I kind of call out the media for its failings on this. And I cite Terry Hansen's book, which if anyone can find it, if you read one book related to this subject, try to find Terry Hansen's book called The Missing Times, UFOs and media complicity in the cover-up. It's a fascinating book.
I don't know this book.
Oh man, you got it. This is one of the best books I've ever read on topic.
When was this written? What period?
I think it was published in 2000, and it's heavily researched. Terry was something of an academic, not unlike Richard Dolan. Unfortunately, he passed away suddenly from a heart attack, I think 7 or 8 years ago. The book's out of print, but I bet you can find a used copy. It's just a wonderful book, and it has a lot of the stories we've discussed today, a lot of the cases like Maelstrom, and it looks at things through a media lens and how dark that lens really is. And it's a fascinating read. I highly recommend it. Read it before you read my book, although I do excerpt some of Terry's material in the book.
Well, thanks for the tip. I'm going to look for it. I don't know it, and now I have something to look forward to.
Yeah, it's a really great read.
Martin, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much. You guys, this is Martin Keller. He is the author of the Space Pen Club, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, UFO Disclosure, Consciousness, and Other Mind Zoomers. Martin, I hope we can do this again. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking to my fellow space brother.
Let's do it. Thanks, Michael. Very
right,
generous of you to give me the time.